His name became synonymous with discovery itself. Archimedes, the greatest scientist and engineer of the ancient world, whose inventions were millennia ahead of their time. His legendary cry of Eureka passed into history forever as the ultimate symbol of sudden illumination. But who, in reality, was this man whose mind served as the most formidable weapon of his age? This is the story of his life and his genius. It will recount how, while solving the problem of a king's crown, he discovered a fundamental law of physics simply by taking a bath, and how, almost as a game, utilizing a system of levers and pulleys, he single-handedly launched an enormous ship. But above all, it is the narrative of the great siege of Syracuse, of how a single man, already ancient, armed solely with the power of his intellect, held back the onslaught of the invincible Roman army for nearly 2 years. It is the history of his diabolical machines, giant catapults, claws that sank ships, and the legendary death rays, a system of mirrors that, legend tells, set the Roman fleet ablaze from a distance. It is an exploration of the tragic end of his life, when the greatest mind of his time was cut short by the sword of a simple soldier, and the account of his immortal legacy, of the laws and principles that laid the foundations for all modern physics and engineering. The story of Archimedes begins in the city of Syracuse, on the sunny and fertile island of Sicily, around the year 287 BC. In that era, Syracuse was not merely a simple city. It was a bustling and cosmopolitan metropolis, one of the largest, richest, and most influential cities in the entire ancient world. Founded by Greek colonists many centuries prior, it was the true New York of the ancient Mediterranean. Its enormous and perfectly protected double bay was constantly crowded with hundreds of merchant ships from Egypt, Carthage, Greece, and Rome. In its noisy markets, one could hear dozens of languages and purchase any product, from African ivory to Greek wine and Egyptian grain. The city was adorned with majestic temples, theaters, and public buildings. It was a center of commerce, culture, science, and, of course, military might. Archimedes was born into a highly favorable and privileged environment. His father, Phidias, was the court astronomer and mathematician to the enlightened ruler of Syracuse, the tyrant, in the Greek sense of the word, Hiero II. Furthermore, according to some sources, his family was directly related to the king himself. This meant that the young Archimedes, from his very childhood, was free from the need to worry about his daily sustenance. He could dedicate himself completely, without reservation, to what interested him most in the world: the knowledge of the universe. Science. His genius manifested very early. But it was not the genius of a poet, an artist, or a politician. It was a genius of a completely different and rare breed. The genius of a mathematician and a physicist. His mind was structured differently. Where other people saw simple objects, he saw forms, volumes, levers, centers of gravity, and hidden laws. His playground was not a courtyard with playmates, but the gigantic and noisy shipyards of Syracuse. He could spend hours in complete solitude, sitting on the shore, watching as thousands of laborers, with the aid of complex and creaking systems of pulleys, winches, and levers, lifted enormous blocks of stone weighing several tons for the construction of new temples. Or how, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, they launched heavy, 3-decked war triremes into the water. But he did not simply watch, he analyzed. He tried to understand exactly how the lever worked, why, by applying a small effort to a long arm, one could lift an enormous weight on a short one. Intuitively, at the level of images, he was grasping the fundamental laws of mechanics that he would later formulate in his treatises. His teacher was the world around him. He observed how ships, as they sailed away, slowly disappeared over the horizon. First, the hull would vanish, then the lower sails, and only at the very end, the tip of the mast. This simple observation was for him a visual and irrefutable proof of the spherical nature of the earth. He studied the operation of the simple water wheels with which peasants irrigated their fields, reflecting on the force of moving water and how it could be utilized. Everything around him, from a drop of rain falling into a puddle to the movement of the stars in the night sky, was for him a great, fascinating, and divine problem demanding a solution. After receiving an excellent initial education in Syracuse, Archimedes, as was customary for any talented and noble young man of the era, departed to complete his training in the scientific capital of the Hellenistic world, Alexandria, in Egypt. Alexandria was no simple city. It was a gigantic and unprecedented city of science, an international research center founded by Alexander the Great and his successors, the Ptolemies. Here, in the famous Museion, the Temple of the Muses, and its legendary Library of Alexandria, which housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the greatest minds of the age gathered. Mathematicians, astronomers, geographers, physicians, and philologists from all over the world flocked there, receiving full sustenance and ideal working conditions from the Egyptian kings. Archimedes found himself in his element. He studied with the followers of the great Euclid, the father of geometry, whose elements had just been written right there in Alexandria. He plunged headfirst into the world of pure and abstract mathematics. It was here, in debates and collaboration with the scholars of Alexandria, that he laid the foundations of integral calculus, concepts that Newton and Leibniz would rediscover nearly 2,000 years later. He developed methods that allowed him to calculate the areas and volumes of the most complex curvilinear figures and bodies, the parabola, the sphere, the cylinder. He calculated the number pi with incredible precision for his time. But unlike many idealistic Greek mathematicians, who, following the precepts of Plato, despised the practical application of science, considering it a lowly, artisanal occupation unworthy of a true philosopher, Archimedes was different. His unique genius lay precisely in the union of abstract, pure theory with the real, physical, and tangible world. In Alexandria, he forged friendships and initiated scientific correspondence with the greatest scholars of his time, such as the astronomer Conon of Samos and the geographer Eratosthenes, who, precisely in those years, with the help of a simple stick and a brilliant calculation, managed for the first time in history to calculate the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Archimedes would maintain correspondence with them until the end of his life, sharing his newest and most precious discoveries in his letters. And it was in Egypt, according to legend, that he created his first great practical invention, which made his name famous far beyond the circle of scholars. Observing how Egyptian peasants, with enormous and exhausting effort, drew water from the Nile to irrigate their fields using primitive buckets and counterweights, he devised a device that was genially simple and incredibly effective. It passed into history as the Archimedes screw. It consisted of a spiral enclosed within a wooden or metal tube. The lower end of the tube was submerged in the water. By turning a crank, the spiral collected the water from below and, moving it along the turns, lifted it easily and rapidly. This device was so simple and efficient that variations of it are still used today, 2,000 years later, to move liquids and granular materials. Upon returning to his native Syracuse, Archimedes sought neither fame nor public office. He led the life of a solitary aristocratic scholar, completely absorbed in his research. He was the classic, absent-minded professor who could forget to eat or sleep when immersed in solving a mathematical or physical problem. It was said that he could spend hours sitting with his gaze fixed on a single point. Then, when an idea struck him,
He would begin to draw geometric figures anywhere, on the floor covered in ashes, in the dusty earth of the courtyard, or even, upon stepping out of the bath, on his own body anointed with oil. His protector, and possibly his relative, King Hero II, admired his intellect. He saw in him not only a great theorist, but a man capable of solving the most complex, practical problems. Constantly, almost as if playing a game, he threw challenges at Archimedes, posing nearly unsolvable engineering and physical problems. And it was precisely one of these royal tasks that led to the most famous discovery of Archimedes' life, and to the most famous cry in the history of science.
King Hero II of Syracuse was not only a powerful ruler, but also a deeply pious man and a great patron of the arts. Having decided to offer a new, magnificent golden laurel crown as a gift to one of the city's temples, he summoned Syracuse's finest goldsmith. The king, personally and before witnesses, weighed and handed the master a precisely measured ingot of pure gold. The goldsmith, having received the commission, retired to his workshop. A few weeks later, he returned to the palace and presented Hero with his creation. The crown was magnificent. The skillfully forged golden leaves and vines appeared almost alive. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The king was satisfied. To verify the artisan's honesty, the crown was immediately weighed in his presence on the most precise scales. The weight corresponded down to the last gram to that of the gold originally provided. The goldsmith received a generous reward and departed with full honors. But a few days later, unsettling rumors began to reach the king. Anonymous accusers, perhaps envious competitors of the goldsmith himself, whispered that the artisan was a swindler. They claimed he had stolen a considerable portion of the pure gold and, in its place, had mixed in silver, a much cheaper metal of similar color, while cleverly maintaining the exact agreed-upon weight. Hero was furious. On one hand, he felt offended in his noblest sentiments. He had intended to offer the gods a gift of pure gold, and he had possibly been deceived into offering a forgery. On the other hand, he had no proof. Accusing such a renowned master of such a crime without conclusive evidence would mean dishonoring himself. But how to verify the accusation? How to determine if the crown contained an alloy without damaging the magnificent work of art? Cutting it or melting it down to check the purity of the alloy was unthinkable. The problem seemed absolutely irresolvable. And so, as had happened on other occasions when an impossible task required a solution, he summoned the only person in Syracuse whose mind he valued above all others, his friend, and possibly relative, Archimedes. Archimedes was intrigued. This was not a simple domestic problem about theft. It was an elegant and beautiful scientific problem that required an unconventional solution. He listened to the king, examined the crown, and weighed it. Then he retired to his home, promising to think about it. He immediately understood the key. He knew from his previous investigations in natural philosophy that different metals have different densities. 1 kilogram of gold, being a much heavier and denser metal, occupied less space, that is, it had a smaller volume than 1 kilogram of silver. This meant that if the crown was made of pure gold, its volume should be exactly equal to that of a gold ingot of the same weight. But if the cunning goldsmith had mixed in silver, which is lighter and more voluminous than gold, to maintain the same weight, the crown would inevitably have to be slightly larger in volume. The problem, therefore, reduced to a seemingly simple question: how to precisely measure the volume of an object of such a complex, irregular, and open-work shape as a laurel crown without breaking or deforming it. He could easily measure the volume of a simple cube or sphere using geometric formulas, but how to measure the volume of the crown? For days and nights, Archimedes was completely absorbed in this problem. He walked through his house like a sleepwalker, forgetting to eat and sleep, mumbling to himself, weighing different objects in his hands and trying to find a solution. He tried different approaches. Perhaps he attempted to make a wax copy and then measure its volume. Perhaps he tried covering it with fine sand. But all these methods were imprecise. The solution eluded him. And then, one day, weary of his endless and fruitless reflections, he went to the public baths to relax. As he submerged himself into a marble bathtub filled to the brim, he relaxed into the warm water. He noticed something that millions of people before him had noticed, but to which no one had given importance. He noticed that the water level in the bathtub rose, and that a certain amount of water spilled over the edge onto the floor. And at that precise instant, in his brilliant brain, prepared by thousands of hours of reflection, the scattered pieces of the puzzle clicked into a single, simple, clear, and elegant image. He had understood. He comprehended with absolute and dazzling clarity that the volume of water his body had displaced was exactly equal to the volume of his body submerged in the water. And that meant he had found a universal and perfect way to measure the volume of any irregularly shaped object. According to legend, seized by an incredible, almost divine joy at his discovery, Archimedes leaped from the bathtub and, forgetting to dress, completely naked, ran through the streets of Syracuse toward his home, shouting at the top of his lungs a single Greek word. Eureka! Eureka! Meaning, I have found it. I have found it. What followed was a matter of technique and a triumphant presentation. Archimedes organized a true scientific demonstration for King Hiero. He took 2 ingots, one of pure gold and one of pure silver, each with the exact weight of the troubled crown. Then he filled a large vessel with water to the brim. First, he carefully submerged the silver ingot and, with the help of a measuring cup, precisely measured the volume of water displaced. Then he refilled the vessel to the brim and did the same with the gold ingot. As he expected, the gold ingot, being considerably denser, displaced noticeably less water than the silver ingot of equal weight. The moment of truth arrived. Filling the vessel for a 3rd time in the presence of the king and the courtiers, he slowly submerged the crown itself and measured the volume of water it displaced. It turned out that the crown had displaced more water than the pure gold ingot of equal weight, but less than the silver ingot. The conclusion was irrefutable and devastating for the goldsmith. The crown was not made of pure gold. The fraud had been demonstrated elegantly, scientifically, and irrefutably. This story, whether entirely true or embellished, has passed into the annals of science forever as the symbol of scientific enlightenment. But the discovery Archimedes made was much more fundamental than simply unmasking swindlers. He discovered and formulated the fundamental law of hydrostatics, which today we know as Archimedes' principle. Any body submerged in a fluid, liquid or gas, experiences an upward buoyant force equal to the weight of the fluid displaced. This simple and elegant law explained everything. Why some objects, like a stone, sink while others, like wood, float. Why a giant, heavy iron ship can stay afloat. This discovery became the foundation of all hydromechanics, shipbuilding, and many other areas of science and technology. But for Archimedes himself, it was not just the solution to a specific problem, however complex. It was another triumphant confirmation of his primary belief, his life philosophy, that the world is not chaotic, but ordered, according to strict, knowable, and beautiful mathematical laws in their simplicity, and that the human mind, with the help of logic and experiment, is capable of discovering and utilizing these laws. The discovery of the fundamental law of hydrostatics brought Archimedes fame far beyond Syracuse, but his genius,
like the universe he sought to comprehend, was boundless. His mind was not limited merely to floating bodies. He was obsessed with the idea of understanding and describing, in the language of mathematics, all the fundamental forces that govern the physical world. And the primary force, the principal magic available to ancient man to transform the world, was mechanics. Archimedes was the first in history to transform mechanics from a collection of intuitive, practical, and artisanal techniques into a rigorous, precise, almost axiomatic mathematical science. His primary tool of investigation and his greatest intellectual passion was the lever. Of course, people had used levers for thousands of years before him. The builders of the Egyptian pyramids, the architects of Greek temples, all intuitively understood that a long pole placed under a stone allowed one to move an enormous weight. But this was the knowledge of the craftsman, passed down by word of mouth. No one before Archimedes could answer the question with precision, why does it work? And according to what law? Archimedes was the first to formulate and mathematically prove the universal law of the lever. In his treatise on the equilibrium of planes, starting from simple and self-evident axioms, he deduced his great principle. Bodies are in equilibrium when their weights are inversely proportional to their distances from the fulcrum. In simple terms, he demonstrated that force and distance exist in a strict inverse proportion. To lift a load twice as heavy, one needs to apply force to a lever arm twice as long. To lift a load 100 times heavier, one needs an arm 100 times longer. This apparently simple discovery had colossal, almost metaphysical consequences.
It meant that with a lever long enough and a fulcrum to rest it on, a single man could theoretically move any weight, however inconceivable. According to legend, seized by enthusiasm at this omnipotence of reason, Archimedes pronounced his second famous, immortal, and almost blasphemous phrase, addressed to his friend and protector, King Hiero II. "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." King Hiero, astonished by such incredible self-confidence, demanded immediate proof. He did not ask him to move the earth, but he proposed a simpler, though no less impressive task. In the port of Syracuse, the construction of the Syracusia had just been completed. It was a gigantic, three-decked vessel, the true Titanic of the ancient world. It was so enormous and heavy that not even the combined and desperate strength of hundreds of laborers and dozens of teams of oxen could launch it into the water. The ship was stranded on the slipway. And so, Archimedes, accepting the royal challenge, locked himself in his workshop. He did not invent anything new. He simply combined his knowledge of levers and pulleys with genius. He designed and built a complex system of compound pulleys, dozens of interconnected wheels through which ropes passed, that multiplied the force applied by a man hundreds of times over. When everything was ready, a great crowd gathered on the shore. According to a more dramatic version of the legend, Archimedes seated the king in a place of honor, handed him the end of the rope from this complex system, and the king, without apparent effort, simply by pulling the rope, moved the gigantic vessel of several tons, which glided smoothly and majestically into the water. According to another, more plausible version, Archimedes did it himself, calmly turning the crank of a winch connected to the pulley system. The effect was overwhelming. The crowd gathered in the harbor stood paralyzed in reverent awe, and then erupted in applause. It did not seem like science. It seemed like pure magic. King Hiero, impressed, declared that from that moment on, anything Archimedes said must be believed. But Archimedes did not stop at simple mechanisms. He was obsessed with the idea of calculating and measuring. He created the foundations of all statics, the science of equilibrium. He was the first to develop mathematical methods to calculate the center of gravity of various plane figures and three-dimensional bodies. This had enormous practical importance for architecture, construction, and naval engineering, allowing for the creation of more stable and balanced structures. He was also a brilliant astronomer, although his main works on astronomy have unfortunately barely survived. But we know that he built at least two astounding devices that marveled his contemporaries. One was a great celestial globe upon which the constellations were depicted. The second, much more complex, was a mechanical planetarium. It was a bronze sphere, inside of which a complex and ingenious system of gears set in motion models of the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. This device showed their apparent movement across the sky with incredible precision, demonstrated the phases of the moon, and even predicted solar and lunar eclipses. When, many years later, the Romans would capture Syracuse, the consul Marcellus, despite the order to loot the city, would forbid his soldiers to touch the house of Archimedes, and would take this planetarium back to Rome as one of his most valuable trophies. The great orator Cicero, who saw it a century and a half later, wrote with admiration that this Sicilian barbarian had managed to create a mechanism that modeled the universe, and that in this single device there was more genius than in nature itself. Archimedes was, in essence, the first true mathematical physicist in history. He was deeply convinced that the entire world, all of nature, from the movement of planets to the floating of a ship, could and should be described in the precise and elegant language of geometry and numbers. He wrote treatises on everything, on the equilibrium of planes, on floating bodies, on spirals, on the measurement of the circle. His mind was so abstract and powerful that he even created a numbering system to write any number, however large. In his famous treatise, The Sand Reckoner, he posed a seemingly childish question: how many grains of sand would fit in the entire universe? To answer it, first relying on the astronomical models of the time, he calculated the approximate size of the universe. Then, he developed a revolutionary system of powers that allowed him to operate with numbers that far exceeded the myriad, 10,000, the largest number that had its own name in Greek. His final result, a number with 63 zeros, was incredibly huge. But the main point was not the figure itself, but the fact that he demonstrated that the human mind is capable of conceiving, describing, and operating even with the infinite. And yet, according to the historian Plutarch, Archimedes, this great practical man, was at the bottom of his soul a pure theorist. He despised his own ingenious practical inventions, the screw, the pulley, the planetarium, considering them mere games of geometry, unworthy of a true scholar. His only true passion was pure science, the search for truth's sake, the contemplation of the harmony of numbers and forms. He could not even imagine that very soon his native city would demand that he cast aside his pure theories. He did not know that it would be precisely his games and toys that would become the only hope of Syracuse, and that he, a philosopher, would have to become the chief engineer of the most terrible and famous siege of his time. The peaceful and contemplative life of Archimedes, dedicated to pure science, was abruptly interrupted by the thunder of high politics. The world he knew was crumbling. The two greatest superpowers of the age, Rome and Carthage, were locked in a mortal struggle, the Second Punic War, and Sicily, situated directly between them, became one of the primary theaters of operation. For a long time, the wise and elderly King Hiero II, Archimedes' protector, had maneuvered skillfully between the two giants, maintaining his alliance with Rome and ensuring peace and prosperity for his city. But in 215 BC, Hiero died. Power passed to his 15-year-old grandson, Hieronymus, inexperienced and ambitious. Yielding to the persuasions of the pro-Carthaginian party at court and dazzled by Hannibal's brilliant victories in Italy, the young king made a fatal error. He broke the long-standing alliance with Rome and defected to the side of Carthage. For Rome, this was an unheard-of betrayal, a stab in the back. The reaction was immediate and ruthless. In 214 BC, one of the finest Roman armies under the command of Marcus Claudius Marcellus was dispatched against the walls of Syracuse. Marcellus was the complete opposite of Archimedes. He was not a scholar. He was a stern, experienced, pragmatic soldier. They called him the Sword of Rome. He did not win his victories with cunning, but with the brute force and discipline of his legions. He was convinced he would take this Greek city by storm in a matter of days. He was profoundly mistaken. He had failed to account for one thing. Against the full might of his legions, against his siege engines, against his fleet, rose a single man, an old man of over 70 years. Archimedes. When the Roman ships appeared on the horizon, the rulers of Syracuse, gripped by panic, turned to their great fellow citizen, begging him to cast aside his mathematical treatises and apply his genius to the defense of his native city.
Archimedes, who had despised applied science his entire life, accepted.
Patriotism and a sense of duty proved stronger than his philosophical principles, and Syracuse, under his direction, was transformed into an impregnable, intelligent fortress. The Romans initiated a simultaneous assault by land and sea. Marcellus, aboard his flagship, personally directed the naval attack. His fleet consisted of 60 quinqueremes, massive warships with 5 banks of oars. Some of them had been converted into floating siege towers called sambucae. These were gigantic ladders mounted on 2 ships lashed together, designed to be lowered onto the city walls. The Romans, confident in their numerical and technical superiority, launched their assault. And then began what the Roman historian Plutarch would later describe as a battle of gods and giants. When the Roman ships entered range, the walls of Syracuse, hitherto silent, suddenly sprang to life. At an invisible command from Archimedes, dozens of his improved catapults and ballistae opened fire simultaneously. But this was no ordinary bombardment. Archimedes, a mathematical genius, had calculated the trajectories and ranges for every type of weapon. First spoke the most powerful long-range catapults, hurling enormous stone blocks weighing several hundred kilograms. These projectiles crashed down with terrifying thunder upon the Roman ships, smashing decks and shattering oars. When the fleet, suffering losses, moved closer, less powerful but faster-firing weapons came into action, sweeping the decks with a rain of smaller stones and iron bolts. And for the ships that managed to reach the very walls, Archimedes had prepared a special surprise. Numerous, almost invisible loopholes had been drilled into the walls, from which scorpions, light crossbow-like weapons, fired accurate and deadly shots at the crews. The Roman sailors were terrified. They were not fighting an army, but an invisible, all-seeing, diabolical mind.
It seemed the walls themselves were fighting against them.
But the most terrible thing awaited them at the foot of the walls. When the floating sambucae approached, gigantic mechanisms resembling the necks of cranes suddenly rose from behind the battlements. These were the famous claws of Archimedes. Controlled from the inside by a complex system of ropes and counterweights, these enormous lever cranes dropped either gigantic lead weights that smashed the enemy's ships, or, what was even more terrifying, they gripped the prow of the ship with a massive iron hook. Then, with the help of powerful winches, the soldiers inside hoisted the ship's prow into the air. The vessel stood almost vertically. Men and equipment slid with a crash into the water. And then the rope was suddenly released. The ship fell back with a horrific splash. It took on water and either capsized or sank. The Romans, who considered themselves the masters of the sea, were gripped by a superstitious terror. It seemed to them they were fighting Briareus, the 100-armed giant of ancient myth. Any piece of rope or beam that appeared on the wall threw them into panic. They screamed, "Another of Archimedes' machines!" and rowed in terror to get away. Marcellus, seeing that his day assault had failed and brought only enormous losses and dishonor, decided to try his luck at night, relying on the element of surprise. But here too disappointment awaited him. Archimedes had foreseen this as well. The assault detachments that tried to place ladders against the walls under the cover of darkness were met by the same machines, now operating blindly but with no less efficiency. After the failure of the night assault, Marcellus, with bitter irony, addressed his engineers. "Shall we stop fighting against this geometer who, sitting on the shore, sinks our ships with dishonor and outdoes the 100-armed giants of mythology?" He was forced to abandon the idea of a quick storming.
The invincible Roman army, for the first time in many years, had suffered a humiliating defeat. And it had been inflicted not by another general, but by a single, elderly scholar, armed only with the power of his intellect. The siege of Syracuse turned into a long, exhausting blockade, and ahead lay months of war, in which the genius of Archimedes would manifest itself with a new force, even more terrifying, almost divine. After abandoning the hope of a quick storming, Marcellus shifted to a long and methodical blockade. He was certain that hunger and disease would accomplish what his legions could not. But here, too, an unpleasant surprise awaited him. Syracuse, thanks to its harbor, which the Roman fleet could not completely blockade, continued to receive supplies by sea from its Carthaginian allies. The siege dragged on, and during all this time, Archimedes did not sit idly by. He continued to perfect the city's defenses, transforming it into a true fortress of reason. Every stretch of wall, every tower, every approach to the sea was converted into a lethal trap. Ancient historians like Polybius and Plutarch have left us almost fantastic descriptions of the diabolical machines created by the genius of Archimedes. His primary strength lay, of course, in projectile weapons. Catapults and ballistae existed before Archimedes, but he brought their design to perfection. He was not a simple engineer. He was a mathematician. He calculated the ideal ratios between the length of the levers, the tension of the ropes, and the weight of the projectile. His machines were not just powerful, they were incredibly precise. He created an entire tiered system of defense. At long range, the most powerful catapults operated, hurling stone blocks weighing up to 250 kilograms over a distance of several hundred meters. The Romans described how these gigantic rocks, cleaving the air with a terrifying whistle, crashed down upon their ships, smashing decks and destroying everything in their path, or fell into the midst of the legions, leaving bloody clearings in their wake. For medium distances, less powerful but faster-firing weapons were designated. They covered the enemy with a rain of smaller stones, the size of a fist, turning the decks of ships and the ground beneath the attackers' feet into a deadly quarry. And for hand-to-hand combat, right at the walls, Archimedes had prepared his most terrible surprise. He installed hundreds of light, maneuverable scorpions in numerous hidden loopholes. These machines, resembling giant crossbows, fired short, heavy iron bolts with incredible speed and precision. They literally pierced Roman shields and armor, leaving the legionaries who approached the walls not a single chance. But his most famous and terrifying invention was the so-called Claw of Archimedes. These were gigantic cranes installed on the city walls facing the sea. Their design was genially simple. It consisted of an enormous lever.
On one end was a counterweight, and on the other, a chain with a massive iron hook resembling the beak of a bird of prey. When a Roman ship dared to approach the wall and found itself under the claw, the mechanism was activated. The enormous hook descended with a crash, gripped the prow of the ship, and with the help of powerful winches turned by dozens of men hidden behind the wall, began to lift it out of the water. Imagine the terror of the Roman sailors. Their massive, heavy warship suddenly, like a toy, began to rise into the air. It stood almost vertically. Men, weapons, and equipment slid with screams and thunder from the deck into the sea. And then, when the ship was hoisted to its maximum height, the rope was suddenly released. The multi-ton hulk fell back into the water with a horrific splash. It took on water through its sides and either sank immediately or capsized, dragging the sailors remaining on board to the bottom. Plutarch wrote that the Romans were so demoralized by these machines that they panicked at the sight of any beam or rope on the wall, screaming, "Archimedes is plotting something again," and fleeing in terror. The siege turned into a psychological war, and in this war, Archimedes was the absolute victor.
But the most famous, legendary, and controversial of all his war machines are, of course, the burning mirrors, or, as they would be called later, the death rays. According to the testimonies of later ancient authors, Archimedes used this system during an attack by the Roman fleet on a clear, sunny day. On his orders, either a large concave mirror or, more likely, a multitude of flat copper or bronze shields polished to a shine were set up on the walls. The soldiers, following his commands, simultaneously directed the reflected sunbeams toward a single point, the sails, or the tarred wooden hull of a Roman ship sitting at arrow's distance. The concentrated sunlight, according to legend, was so powerful that in a few seconds the wooden ship burst into flames like a torch. The Roman fleet, attacked by divine fire from the sky, retreated in terror. Did this weapon really exist? Historians and scientists debate it to this day. Many consider it only a beautiful legend born after Archimedes' death to further aggrandize his genius. Dozens of experiments have been conducted trying to recreate this effect, and their results are ambiguous. But, regardless of whether the death rays were reality or myth, the mere fact that such a legend arose speaks volumes. The genius of Archimedes was so great, so superhuman in the eyes of his contemporaries and descendants, that they were willing to believe in any miracle, however fantastic, wrought by his mind. Yes, thanks to the genius of an old man who preferred pure mathematics to the base trade of engineering, the once doomed city of Syracuse successfully repelled the attacks of the most powerful army in the world for nearly 2 years. But not even genius is omnipotent. The fate of the city was ultimately decided not by the force of arms, but by human betrayal.
The year was 212 BC. The grueling and almost desperate siege of Syracuse had dragged on for nearly 2 years. The mighty Roman army, under the command of one of its finest generals, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, had failed to take the city by storm. The genius of a single man, Archimedes, had proved stronger than the discipline of the legions and the power of the Roman fleet. But what military force and technology could not achieve was finally accomplished by betrayal, chance, and human negligence. Marcellus, desperate to take the city by force and suffering enormous losses from Archimedes' diabolical machines, shifted to a tactic of a long and exhausting blockade. He surrounded Syracuse with a tight ring of troops and ships, hoping that starvation and disease would do what his soldiers could not. But here, too, an unpleasant surprise awaited him. Syracuse, thanks to its enormous harbor, which the Roman fleet could never completely blockade, continued to secretly receive supplies by sea from its Carthaginian allies. The siege dragged on, turning into a war of attrition, and during all this time, Archimedes did not sit idly by. He continued to perfect the city's defenses, transforming it into a true fortress of reason. But the Romans were learning too. They no longer approached the walls, fearing the claws, and kept their fleet out of range of the catapults. The war became a long, tense standoff, where both sides waited for the enemy to make a mistake. And the Syracusans made that mistake first. They became convinced of their own invulnerability. They grew accustomed to the idea that their walls were impregnable and that the genius of Archimedes would always find an answer to any threat. This confidence turned into negligence. They prepared for the great annual feast in honor of the goddess Artemis. It was a grand 3-day festival, accompanied by banquets, wine, and general revelry.
Roman spies inside the city immediately informed Marcellus that during the holidays, discipline would relax, the guard on the walls would be sparse, and many soldiers would be drunk. Marcellus decided to seize this opportunity. He also knew from intelligence reports and deserters of a vulnerable section of the wall, considerably lower than the rest and poorly guarded. On the night following the end of the feast, when the city, exhausted by 3 days of celebration, sank into a deep, careless, and drunken sleep, an elite detachment of Roman legionaries made their move. Using specially prepared scaling ladders in absolute silence, under the cover of darkness, they scaled the wall precisely at that weakest point. They silently killed the drowsy and unsuspecting guards and opened a small gate from the inside. The Roman troops, like a dark river, flooded into the city. Panic spread instantly. The sound of war horns and the screams of the dying woke the city. The Syracusans, taken by surprise, tried to resist, but it was too late. They could not organize a unified defense. Part of the city was captured almost instantly. However, the main and most fortified districts, including the island fortress of Ortygia and the commercial district of Acradina, where Archimedes most likely lived, continued to fight desperately. The siege turned into ferocious, bloody street fighting that dragged on for several more months. But the fate of Syracuse was sealed. Finally, one of the Syracusan commanders, a Spaniard named Mauricus, betraying his city, opened another gate to the Romans in the night. The resistance was finally crushed. The city that had defied the power of Rome for nearly 3 years fell. Marcellus, enraged by the long resistance and the enormous losses, gave the city over to the plunder of his soldiers. The massacre, the pillaging, and the violence began. Soldiers burst into houses and temples, killing everyone who crossed their path and taking everything of the slightest value. But even in this moment of triumph and bloody vengeance, Marcellus remembered the man he respected more than all his enemies. He gave the strictest, personal order to his officers. "Find the house of Archimedes and bring him to me alive and unharmed." Marcellus, despite his severity as a true Roman, admired Greek culture and science. He did not want to kill, but to honor his brilliant enemy, perhaps to take into Rome as the most valuable living trophy. He even sent a special officer who knew Archimedes by sight to ensure there were no mistakes. But fate, or blind chance, decreed otherwise. The subsequent events are described in several versions, but they all agree on one thing: the tragic, almost absurd, and ridiculous nature of the great scientist's death. According to the most famous and dramatic version, recounted by Plutarch, a Roman soldier who did not know Archimedes by sight burst into his house in search of loot. He found the 75-year-old man not in panic, not trying to flee or hide his treasures. Archimedes was sitting in his sun-drenched inner courtyard, completely, absolutely absorbed in the solution of a complex geometric problem. He was drawing intricate figures in the sand scattered across the floor. He noticed neither the noise of the battle still raging in the streets, nor the intrusion of a legionary armed to the teeth into his home.
The soldier, shouting brusquely at him, perhaps mistaking him for a simple old man, ordered him to follow him immediately to Marcellus. But Archimedes, irritated at being unceremoniously interrupted from his deep reflections, did not even raise his head to look at him. He simply made a gesture with his hand and pronounced his last, immortal phrase, "Noli turbare circulos meos." Do not disturb my circles. Or in another translation, do not touch my drawings.
The soldier, either not understanding who he was speaking to, or enraged by such incredible arrogance from an old man daring to give him orders in a captured city given over to plunder, flew into a rage. He drew his short Roman sword, the gladius, and with a single blow, killed him. When Marcellus was informed that his order had not been carried out, and that the greatest mind of his time, the man he so respected, had been murdered by a simple, anonymous legionary, legend says he was horrified and despairing. He called the murder a sacrilege. He refused even to see the killer. He ordered that all of Archimedes' surviving relatives be found and paid them the highest honors. And on the tomb of the great scientist, fulfilling exactly his own wish expressed previously, he ordered a monument to be erected. On it was depicted a sphere inscribed within a cylinder, and an inscription recording the mathematical ratio of their volumes which he had discovered. It was a discovery that Archimedes himself, not his war machines, considered his greatest achievement. Thus, by the stupidity, greed, and cruelty of an anonymous soldier, the life of the man whose genius illuminated the entire ancient world was cut short. He did not die of old age or disease. He died defending not his life, but his drawings, his world of pure and perfect ideas, which for him was more valuable and important than anything else in the world. The death of Archimedes at the hands of a Roman soldier was not simply the loss of a man, however great he might have been. It was the tragic, almost symbolic end of an entire era, the era of Hellenistic genius, pure and free, which fell under the onslaught of the brute, pragmatic military force of Rome. Rome conquered Greece, but as the poet Horace would later say, captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror, transmitting her culture and her science. And the legacy of Archimedes became the most valuable part of that loot. Immediately after his death, as often happens, his fame only grew. His war machines, his claws and death rays became surrounded by incredible legends, transforming him from a scholar into a mythical superhero, almost a sorcerer. But his true and imperishable legacy did not reside in these diabolical machines, which he himself despised. It lay in his silent written works on papyrus, in the laws he discovered. The Romans, being excellent engineers and builders rather than theorists, fully appreciated and utilized the practical side of his genius. His law of buoyancy became the foundation of all their shipbuilding. His principles of mechanics, his knowledge of levers and pulleys were used in the construction of aqueducts, bridges, and the Colosseum. The Archimedes screw became the standard mechanism for draining mines and irrigating fields throughout the vast Roman Empire. With the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe, most of his complex mathematical works were lost or forgotten. But they were preserved where ancient wisdom continued to live, in Byzantium and especially in the Arab world. Arab scholars and mathematicians translated his works, commented on them, and developed his ideas. It was thanks to them that Archimedes' legacy did not disappear without a trace.
And when, in the Renaissance, Europe began to awaken, rediscovering antiquity, the works of Archimedes returning to the West through Arabic translations had the effect of a bomb. For Renaissance geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo Galilei, Archimedes became the ultimate authority, an idol, a teacher, with whom they maintained a mental dialogue across the centuries. Leonardo da Vinci was, in essence, the Archimedes of his time. Like his great predecessor, he was obsessed with the union of science and practice. His notebooks are filled with drawings and calculations based directly on Archimedes' works on mechanics, hydraulics, and the center of gravity. And Galileo Galilei, the father of modern science, called himself his direct follower. It was Archimedes, with his method of combining mathematics and experiment, who was the model of the true scientist for Galileo. When Galileo studied the laws of falling bodies, he was, in essence, continuing the work begun by Archimedes. In the 17th century, with the invention of integral and differential calculus by Newton and Leibniz, mathematicians finally obtained the powerful tool that Archimedes had lacked. And they discovered, with astonishment and admiration, that the ancient Greek, without having these tools, with only the help of his brilliant geometry, had managed to achieve the same results that cost them pages of complex calculations. And today, 2,300 years later, we live in a world built upon the laws discovered by this man from Syracuse. Every ship sailing the ocean obeys his law of buoyancy. Every construction crane, lifting a load, uses his principle of the lever. Every engineer, designing a building, calculates the center of gravity according to his methods. But perhaps his greatest legacy does not even lie in these specific laws. It lies in the approach itself. Archimedes was the first to demonstrate that the universe speaks the language of mathematics.
That the most complex phenomena of nature, from the movement of planets to the floating of a grain of sand, can be described by simple, elegant, and universal formulas. He taught humanity that the path to knowledge does not pass through myths and superstitions, but through rigorous logic, precise calculation, and bold experiment. He was the first true theoretical physicist in history. His tomb, with the image of a sphere and a cylinder, was lost to time. The great Roman orator Cicero, while serving as governor in Sicily, found it with difficulty based on descriptions in ancient books covered in weeds, and restored it. But then it was forgotten again. But his true monument is imperishable. It is in every ship, in every bridge, in every mechanism. It is in every line of every physics and mathematics textbook. It is in our own capacity to understand and transform the world through reason. Archimedes died, but the laws he discovered are immortal. They governed the world before him. They govern it now, and they will govern it forever.